Looking at this crime scene, there was a lot of what appeared to be conflicting information in the details of this crime.
A woman is murdered in her apartment in Cocoa Beach, Florida.
Whenever we look at a homicide that occurs in the victim's home, we look at the family first.
But when the victim's own son stops cooperating with police, a family is torn apart. Cocoa Beach, Florida, usually known as a mecca for sunbathers and surfers, and a safe haven for retirees and families. But on one quiet and cloudy December afternoon, a man walks towards his mother's apartment to take her out to lunch. He calls out her name, but gets no answer, so he walks towards the back of her apartment and makes a horrible discovery: the body of his mother lying on her bedroom floor. Detective Bill Flack of the Cocoa Beach Police Department is the first to arrive on the scene.
Got out of the car and there was a pretty large fella standing in the doorway. He was very upset. He was waving his arms in the air and crying and actually yelling, "Someone's killed my mother."
The back door is wide open. There are no signs of forced entry. In the bedroom, drawers are opened and clothes are scattered on the floor. When crime lab technicians arrive at the scene, they find bloodstains on the carpet and the victim lying beside the bed. There's evidence of sexual assault, but no DNA is recovered. The victim also has suffered severe facial injuries, but no weapon is found at the crime scene. The case is given to Detective Brent Bagshaw from the Cocoa Beach Police Department, and he starts the investigation with the victim. Her name is Joyce Czuba, a retiree who escaped the harsh winters of Youngstown, Ohio, by retreating to the seaside town of Cocoa Beach.
Joyce did have a number of friends. There was a group of ladies that she enjoyed coffee with on a weekly basis. They had a coffee club, so to speak. She had just begun dating as well. Her husband had passed away a number of years prior.
When her relatives back in Ohio get the news that she's been murdered, they are devastated. But Joyce Czuba's son, Eric, was the closest to her. And his apartment is just 2 doors down from where his mother was found dead. Now he will have to live with the image of his murdered mother for the rest of his life. But when Detective Bagshaw pays Eric Czuba a visit at the start of the investigation, he is taken aback.
Well, Eric had some very bizarre drawings on his living room wall. Drawings that were sexual in nature, drawings that were almost satanic, so to speak.
The drawings are bizarre enough, but Detective Bagshaw grows more suspicious when neighbors report that Joyce and Eric Czuba were overheard having a heated argument the night before she died.
From what we were told, Eric and his mother were arguing about Eric wanting to use her vehicle. Eric's vehicle was not in very good shape. His mother's car was a lot nicer than his, but she wouldn't let Eric use the vehicle.
Eric's car is parked in the lot behind the complex. And when investigators look in the back seat, they find something that stops them in their tracks: blood. The blood is photographed and sent to the FDLE crime lab for testing to see if it might belong to Joyce Czuba. And Eric Czuba, the devastated son who found his mother's body, becomes the prime suspect in her murder.
The blood found in the vehicle, the fact that several witnesses came forward and had witnessed Eric and his mother in a very heated argument just a couple of days before the homicide. Eric's bizarre behavior with his drawings on the wall.
All signs point to Eric as the murderer. But could a son be capable of killing his own mother? Detective Bagshaw will do everything he can to find out.
The investigator on the case told me that an elderly woman had been killed. She had been beaten severely, strangled, and sexually assaulted in her apartment in Cocoa Beach. And when I heard the details for the very first time, I felt this was a very angry kind of crime.
There appeared to be a lot of facial battery, and generally facial battery occurs between, or statistically, between someone who knows the person who they are attacking.
And when Hinman hears about the argument Eric Czuba had with his mother and the blood found in his car, she agrees. He is an excellent suspect. And to top it off, he has no alibi.
On the morning when the victim's body was later discovered, he said that he left in his car and drove around and really didn't go anywhere. He had cashed a check that she had allegedly written to him at his bank, and then after that, just basically said that he rode around and absolutely no one saw him.
But something about the crime scene doesn't sit well with Hinman.
Even though Eric Czuba seemed like a really good suspect, after we saw the scene and the photographs, profilers had some doubt about whether or not he could have done it.
Coming up on Body of Evidence, Hinman visits the crime scene and comes to a shocking conclusion. Joyce Czuba is found murdered in her apartment in Cocoa Beach, Florida. And the person who found her body is also the person at the top of the suspect list. The victim's 38-year-old son, Eric.
Eric Czuba didn't have an alibi with essentially anyone on the morning of the homicide. The police found out that Eric and his mother had had a major argument the night before she was found murdered, which he didn't mention, but neighbors did.
Wanting to gain more insight, Special Agent Hinman heads to Cocoa Beach to meet with lead detective Brent Bagshaw to discuss the details of the case. The first thing they do is look through every frame of crime scene video.
That's a significant amount of blood.
You can see the obvious signs of trauma there to Joyce Czuba's face, and the obvious signs of a sexual assault as well.
Oh yeah, I see that. She appears to be displayed, and this kind of looks like it was done on purpose.
Yeah, very disturbing.
Posing of the body. It's something that Hinman has seen hundreds of times before in her career, and it tells her exactly what the motive was for Joyce Czuba's murder.
This has all the appearance of a really angry, out of control type of sexual attack.
Yeah, I was real curious as to how you thought his motivation factor played into this crime, whether it was a burglary that went bad or if it was a sexual assault that just turned into this homicide.
Now, it appears that there's too much trauma, although you see the victim's pocketbook and wallet are right there above her head, but it looks more like the sexual assault was the primary intent of this offender.
Special Agent Hinman believes she is dealing with a sexual psychopath, but something still does not seem right. Later, in her hotel room, she inspects the crime scene photos again, picture by picture, and comes to a surprising conclusion about the main suspect.
Based on what happened in this crime scene and the fact that there was a sexual assault, this isn't what I would expect a son to do to his mother. Eric Czuba didn't do this. He didn't kill his mother.
But if Eric Czuba is not the killer, who is? Hinman hopes a visit to the actual crime scene will give her an insight into the murder of Joyce Czuba that crime scene photos can't.
I think it's very important for profilers to actually go to the crime scene, to look around, to see what's around the scene. You can really understand the crime more and from a different perspective when you have an opportunity to actually be at the scene and to walk around.
When Hinman arrives at the apartment complex, she scrutinizes the scene from every possible angle.
Seeing what actually is around the home or the place where the crime occurred helps us to focus in on what type of person would be available to commit this crime or would be present in this area.
As you can see, there's really not a good view of the rear of the complex from the roadway, so someone would have to be familiar.
And I think the person would have to actually walk around behind the apartment complex to really see her, and the perpetrator would know that nobody else is going to hear anything. This looks more like she was a targeted victim and that the offender knew that she was there and that she was there alone.
Eric Czuba certainly knew all of this. Yet Hinman is still positive that he is not the killer. But when investigators ask Eric for a blood sample to compare to the blood from the crime scene, he flat out refuses.
Initially, he was very cooperative, but when it came time to requesting Eric for a blood sample, that's when things changed.
And then Eric Czuba moves out of town. Could this be the behavior of an innocent man? Coming up next, is Special Agent Hinman on the wrong track? Soon after Joyce Czuba is found murdered in her apartment, the main suspect, the victim's son, Eric Czuba, stops cooperating with police and then moves out of town. Some investigators still think he could be the killer, but criminal profiler Dale Hinman is convinced he's not.
If Eric Czuba had been very angry with his mother, then maybe he would have beaten her to death and strangled her. But it would be more likely when a family member kills a mother or a father that they would do this and then leave the person in the bed and perhaps cover them up. So the way the victim was lying didn't look like a son would do this to his own mother.
Then, months after the murder of Joyce Czuba, Hinman gets news that might shed light on the case.
I got a call that 2 other elderly women had been murdered in the same area as Joyce Czuba.
And the hope was to compare these 3 cases and determine whether or not they were related and if this was a serial murder of elderly women.
Hinman returns to Cocoa Beach to meet with the lead investigator. Detective Bagshaw thinks that if the latest homicides are connected, then he might have fresh leads to follow in the Czuba investigation. So he lays out the case files for Hinman to review.
In one of the cases, the crime occurred north of Cocoa Beach, and it happened prior to the Joyce Czuba homicide. It was also an elderly female. She was actually at church doing some volunteer work and was murdered there at the church.
The woman was killed during the day, and the perpetrator used a knife. And the only thing that could possibly connect it to the Joyce Czuba homicide is the age of the victim. And that's not enough for Hinman.
In the second case, this occurred to an elderly female during the same time frame as Joyce Czuba's homicide. It was a nighttime crime. She was in her home. There was forced entry, however, in that case.
The victim was killed at night and sexually assaulted, just like Joyce Czuba. But unlike the Czuba homicide, the perpetrator left DNA evidence at this crime scene. And if the same person committed both crimes, then a DNA hit would lead investigators to the killer of Joyce Czuba. But again, Hinman is sure there is no connection.
While it may look similar and be the south of yours, you have DNA evidence in that. So if you didn't have it in yours, I'm wondering why they would have it in theirs. So I don't think the cases are related.
Okay.
And she's right. Eventually, the DNA leads to another killer. Someone who has a solid alibi on the night of Joyce Czuba's death. It's a frustrating turn of events for Detective Bagshaw.
The investigation itself really kind of stalled somewhat in the fact that we hadn't developed any suspects other than Eric himself.
More time passes, and still, Hinman and Bagshaw have no new leads and no new suspects. Life goes on as usual in Cocoa Beach. And then, another investigator, Lieutenant Buddy Ayers, the head of the Criminal Investigations Division, gets a call about the unsolved Czuba homicide.
The Cocoa Police Department called my house and told me that they had arrested a female prostitute on outstanding warrants. And she told them that she had information regarding the elderly woman that was murdered in Cocoa Beach.
Coming up on Body of Evidence, will this be the tip that breaks the case wide open? Or have investigators hit another dead end? Months after Joyce Czuba is murdered in her apartment, the case is still unsolved. And with no new leads and no new suspects, it is in danger of going completely cold. Then investigators get a call from a woman who claims to have information about the Czuba homicide.
The police continued month after month to pursue every possible lead that came up. And then one day, the police were tipped off that a woman who had been arrested for drugs had a boyfriend that she pointed to as a suspect in this crime.
Lieutenant Ayers heads to the jail to talk to the woman. And what she says stuns him.
She gave us a suspect name, first of all. She gave us the name of Marcelina Penaloza, and that she was in Marcelino's house the night that he came home after murdering Joyce Czuba. She began to tell us how he had blood all over his pants, gifts that he had brought from her house, that he had stole from her house. He also began to demonstrate to her how he murdered Miss Czuba.
These are details that only the killer would know. And when the police take a closer look at Marcelino Penaloza, they discover he has a reputation for hard drinking and violent fights.
Penaloza, as we continued our investigation, we found out that he liked to get in physical confrontations with people. And when he did get in these confrontations, he would headbutt them. Joyce Czuba had some injuries to her that we could not determine how they occurred. And once we received that information about Penaloza's headbutting, we were pretty much able to determine that he actually headbutted her during the crime.
But that's not all that stands out to investigators.
Marcelino Penaloza certainly knew that Joyce Czuba lived in that apartment complex and that she lived in that apartment by herself because, in fact, at the time of the homicide, he lived in the same complex.
It fits Hinman's profile to a T. The killer knew Joyce Czuba and knew she was an easy target. And now investigators have enough to arrest and charge him with the murder of Joyce Czuba. Months later, he goes to trial.
Marcelino Penaloza was found guilty of a number of charges, including first-degree murder, and the judge saw to it that although the jury did not recommend the death sentence, that Marcelino Penaloza would never see freedom again.
Penaloza has never confessed to the crime and has never told investigators why he targeted Joyce Czuba. When asked about the case, Penaloza refuses to say a word. But what about Eric Czuba, once the main focus of the investigation? It turns out that the blood found in Eric's car was his own. He had cut himself weeks before and never cleaned it up. And the argument he had with his mother the night before she died was just that, a disagreement between mother and son.
Eric Czuba moved to Miami. He would was not comfortable, understandably so, staying in the same building where his mother had been murdered. I did have an occasion after the arrest to go down and speak with Eric Czuba at length. You know, Eric and I parted on good terms and wanted the same thing, and that was a conviction in this case.
All the things that made Eric a suspect in the early part of the investigation were dispelled by the police. The argument they had was nothing more than that. It was just an argument. There was blood found in his car, and it turned out not to be Joyce Czuba's blood. Due to a really thorough police investigation, the right man was arrested and charged and convicted for this crime. Essentially, Eric Czuba was the perfect suspect who didn't do it.